Welcome to Unseen Rite, where history isn't written with ink, but with blood, silence, and the things they swore you'd never know. Tonight, we go to Mississippi, 1856, a quiet plantation that, on the surface, looked like every other. Whitewashed walls, cotton fields stretching endlessly, and the cruel rhythm of whips and commands. But beneath it all, something was stirring. A plan so dangerous, so carefully woven, that it would forever stain the soil with whispers of revenge. This isn't folklore. It isn't ghost story. It's what happens when the oppressed turn their silence into strategy. Her name was Celia. To the world around her, she was just another enslaved cook, working inside the Caldwell household. To them, she was invisible. But invisibility has its power. Every meal she served, every plate she carried, every ingredient she touched, she was watching, learning, calculating. They didn't know she could read the patterns of plants. They didn't know she understood what herbs could heal and which could kill. That knowledge wasn't written in books for her. It was carried in memory, passed quietly through whispers, encoded in survival. And when the Caldwell family prepared for a grand feast, 17 guests, all men of power, wealth and cruelty, Celia saw her chance. This supper would not be a celebration. It would be an execution, carried out with a servant's steady hand and a mind sharpened by suffering. What happened that night would never appear in the official histories. Too dangerous, too humiliating, too revealing of just how fragile the chains of power really were. This is the story of the deadly feast of Mississippi, a story of patience, of knowledge turned into weapon, of a woman who used the one tool left to her, the kitchen, to carve justice where none existed. But to understand how this meal became the most forbidden supper in the South, we need to step inside the world of the Caldwell estate, into the rooms where whispers traveled, where plans took shape, and where death waited in the steam of a boiling pot. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these dark historical mysteries. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our viewers across America. Now let's open the first door into this hidden history. The Caldwell estate stood like a monument to Southern wealth. Tall pillars, sprawling verandas, chandeliers glowing against the Mississippi night. But beauty is only a mask, and behind the silk curtains, cruelty was stitched into the walls. The Caldwells weren't just landowners. They were merchants of suffering. Cotton built their fortune, but it was bodies, enslaved bodies, that paid the price. Every brick, every field, every polished silver plate was soaked in the labor of men and women who were never meant to be remembered. Celia, the cook, moved silently through these halls. To the Caldwells, she was nothing more than a pair of hands. But what they didn't understand was this. A servant sees everything. She knew which son stumbled drunk into the quarters at night. She knew which ledger held debts that could break the family. She knew where the master's medicine was kept and how much laudanum he poured into his nightly glass. Knowledge is power, and Celia had been gathering it like kindling, waiting for the right moment to strike a match. That moment drew closer when news broke inside the estate. The Caldwells were preparing a lavish banquet, a show of strength. Politicians, wealthy neighbors, investors, 17 men in all, were expected to dine beneath the golden chandelier. This was not just dinner. This was power on display. And it was here in the heart of that glittering feast that Celia saw her chance. The kitchen became her battlefield. Every ingredient mattered, every drop, every pinch. Herbs that soothed, herbs that silenced, herbs that killed. Celia's hands moved with care, but her mind was elsewhere, playing out what would happen if she succeeded, and what horrors would follow if she failed. She was walking a razor's edge. If a single person suspected her, the punishment would be brutal, unimaginable. But if she succeeded, 17 men of power would fall in one night. The plan was dangerous, impossible, Yet history is shaped not by the safe, but by the desperate. And as the night of the feast drew closer, the house grew tense. Servants whispered, guests arrived. The silver was polished until it gleamed. No one knew that beneath the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread, another ingredient was waiting, one that would never be written into the recipes. The night arrived. Lanterns lit the path to the Caldwell estate, glowing like beacons against the dark Kentucky sky. Carriages rolled in one after another, wheels crunching gravel, polished boots stepping down. Laughter and cigars filled the air. These were men who believed they were untouchable, politicians, land barons, merchants, the masters of wealth and law. Inside, the dining room gleamed. The chandelier burned bright above the long oak table, silver cutlery aligned with military precision, crystal glasses waiting for wine. 17 seats, each one reserved for power. And in the shadows beyond the doorway, Celia watched. The kitchen roared with noise, knives against cutting boards, the hiss of boiling pots, the smell of spiced meats. To the other servants, this was just another exhausting night. But to Celia, every dish carried meaning. Every bowl, every plate, every hidden drop was part of her design. She had not acted alone. Quiet alliances had formed in whispers, women who had lost children to the auction block, men beaten for looking a master in the eye. They didn't need to be convinced. They only needed someone willing to risk everything, and that someone was her. The guests took their seats, their voices rising with arrogance. Toasts were made, glasses clinked, food was served. Celia moved among them with a steady hand. But inside, her heart thundered like a war drum. Each time she placed a dish, she felt the weight of the gamble. Her eyes flicked to Dina, the seamstress, who lingered near the staircase. Dina's daughter had been promised to a trader that very week. Her pain had sharpened into something more dangerous than grief. It had become resolve. The room smelled of roasted lamb and sweet wine, but beneath it, something darker lingered, something unseen. The men laughed, oblivious. Forks struck plates, wine spilled. Words grew louder, looser as the meal went on. And then a cough, sharp, cutting through the laughter. One man gripped the edge of the table, face twisting. Another dropped his glass, crimson wine spilling like blood across the linen. Chairs scraped, voices turned to panic. 17 men had sat at that table. Not all of them would rise again. And upstairs, the Caldwells themselves realized, too late, that the empire they had built on suffering had finally turned on them. This was no accident, this was no curse. This was justice, stitched and cooked in silence. The chandelier rattled as panic swept the room. Forks clattered to the floor, silver trays overturned. Men who moments earlier boasted about their wealth and power now clawed at their throats, their fine coats tearing under the strain of desperation. Celia stood frozen for a heartbeat, the tray trembling in her hands. She had imagined this moment countless times, but nothing prepared her for the sight of it. The mighty brought low in an instant. Gasps turned to shrieks. Chairs toppled. Some tried to stagger for the door, but their legs buckled. The poison worked quickly, cruelly, without mercy. "Fetch the doctor!" someone roared. But even the doctor, seated at the far end, was slumped over his plate, face pale, lips blue. The Caldwell matriarch rose from her seat, demanding order. Her voice, once the iron rod of the estate, cracked with fear. "This is blasphemy," she cried, pointing toward the servants. "Witchcraft!" But the truth was simpler, and far more dangerous than superstition. Celia lowered her eyes, moving silently toward the kitchen, where Dina waited. The seamstress's hands were clenched tight around a folded handkerchief, her daughter's small token tied inside it. She didn't ask what was happening in the dining hall. She already knew. For years they had watched these men trade lives as if they were commodities. For years they stitched their clothes, cooked their meals, raised their children. And now, all of that labor, all of that silence had converged on one night, one table, one reckoning. The walls echoed with groans and crashing glass. The grand oak table, once a stage of wealth, became a battlefield of convulsing bodies. And yet, Amidst the chaos, a strange calm spread through the servants' quarters. Whispers of fear turned to nods of understanding. For the first time, they felt something forbidden. Hope. Above them, the Caldwells' world was crumbling. But below, in the hidden corridors and kitchens, a new power was being born. The question wasn't whether the empire of cruelty would fall. That was already decided. The real question was, what would rise in its place? By morning, the Caldwell estate no longer resembled the seat of power it had been only hours earlier. The great hall was quiet. The velvet curtains hung heavy, but the air inside was sour with the stench of spilt wine and death. Flies already buzzed over plates that had never been cleared. Servants walked carefully, their eyes averted, carrying water to cleanse the floors. But there was no real cleansing what had happened. Outside, the sun rose gently over the Kentucky fields, painting them gold. But for the first time, the overseer's whistle did not pierce the morning. No orders barked, no lashes cracked. The machinery of cruelty had stopped. Celia watched from the steps, her apron still stained from the night before. She saw men hauling the bodies away, covered in linen. She counted them silently. She knew the names. She remembered the hands that had once struck her. Now they were still. Dina stood nearby, her expression unreadable. She had not slept. Her daughter clung to her skirt wide-eyed, not yet able to grasp the scale of what her mother had done. Whispers moved through the quarters. Some said it was God's hand. Others swore it was a curse, a punishment long overdue. But those who knew Dina's sharp mind understood this was neither accident nor miracle. This was design. The Caldwell estate, once feared across the county, now felt hollow. Its masters silenced, its wealth meaningless. And yet, danger lingered. The county would notice. Other families would come asking questions, and when they did, suspicion would fall not on fate or chance, but on the ones who had served, who had watched, who had finally struck back. Dina understood this better than anyone. Freedom had been tasted, but survival demanded silence, caution, calculation. So as the first wagons carried the dead away, Dina whispered to Celia, "Not a word, not yet." Because the true rebellion wasn't only in the act of vengeance. It was in how long they could hold the secret, and how far it could spread. Word spread quickly through Kentucky. By the third day, riders arrived at the estate, summoned not by the Caldwells, but by the eerie silence. Neighbors found the house subdued, its windows shuttered, its grand parlor stripped of laughter. Servants moved cautiously, rehearsing half-truths with every breath. The official story whispered out was simple. Illness, a sudden fever, a curse of the swamp air. Doctors were brought in, men with stiff collars and leather satchels. They examined the bodies, poking, prodding, sniffing the air. But poison was not easily traced in those days, and Dina's knowledge of herbs had been exact. Nothing obvious remained, only lifeless flesh. Yet doubts lingered. The sheriff demanded names, demanded to know who had prepared the food, who had poured the wine. Dina's hands were called into question. She stood still, her eyes lowered, her tone measured. She spoke of following orders, of loyalty, of doing only what she was told. Behind her, Celia clenched her fists, terrified that one misplaced word could unravel everything. The younger servants, less seasoned in deception, stumbled over their answers. But Dina's presence steadied them. Still whispers spread beyond the estate. Other families began locking their wine cellars. Wives inspected their garments before wearing them. In hushed tones, they spoke of rebellion taking root, of invisible weapons crafted by invisible hands. To the county, the Caldwells' fall was a warning. If one family of such wealth could be undone from within, then none were safe. Fear became its own contagion, spreading faster than truth. But to those still trapped in bondage, Dina's act was more than vengeance. It was possibility. It was proof that resistance could be clever, silent, devastating. The question now was not if others would notice. It was how long before someone tried to follow her path, and whether the county's suspicion would turn into wrath. Dina's silence was her greatest weapon. She never confessed, never gloated, never revealed the full measure of her hand. But among the enslaved, her actions spoke louder than words ever could. At night, in the cramped cabins where whispers carried like smoke, her story began to change shape. It was no longer just about a seamstress avenging her daughter. It became legend. Dina, the woman who stitched death into velvet. Dina, who turned the Caldwells' own luxury into their undoing. Other women leaned closer, desperate to know her methods. How did she prepare the roots? How did she slip the tincture into the wine? How did she keep her face calm while the world around her collapsed? She never gave them the full recipe. She knew too much knowledge, too quickly spread, could bring ruin down on all their heads, but she gave them something else: understanding. That their bondage was not as absolute as they had been told, that even in silence, even under chains, their minds remained their own. Across Kentucky, stories of small acts of resistance multiplied. A planter grew mysteriously ill after a quarrel with his cook. A merchant's prized jacket discolored his skin. A household's prized horses sickened, their oats turned bitter. Each incident fed the growing paranoia of the slave-holding elite. Meanwhile, Dina remained outwardly unshaken. Her hands still stitched gowns, her words still carried obedience, her face still carried the softness of submission. But beneath every bow of the head was calculation, because Dina knew the greatest danger was not the Caldwells' death, it was survival. If suspicion hardened into certainty, she would face not just punishment, but erasure. And so her secret spread like smoke, never grasped, always shifting, impossible to hold. The county was watching, the planters were whispering, the law was tightening. But beneath it all, the enslaved were listening, and they were learning. By the summer of 1854, the Caldwell estate no longer carried the carefree sound of banquets and dances. The walls, once bright with chatter and the rustle of silks, now echoed with silence. Suspicion had settled like a permanent fog. Plantation owners in the county whispered of a shadow moving among them. One planter claimed his wife's favorite shawl carried an odor that burned her skin. Another swore his servant's bread was laced with some unholy tincture. Fear twisted into paranoia, and paranoia became law. The county sheriff arrived one humid morning at the Caldwell gates, boots heavy with purpose, eyes sharp with the hunger of accusation. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood 2 deputies and a local magistrate, their presence a silent verdict. The Caldwells' misfortunes could not remain unexplained forever. They questioned the household first. Servants stammered, overseers shifted uneasily. The Caldwell's surviving kin swore vengeance against whoever had turned their fortune into ash. Yet no one dared speak Dina's name, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Because to accuse her was to acknowledge her power, and to acknowledge her power was to risk becoming her next target. Still, the sheriff's gaze kept returning to her. A woman too composed, too quiet, her hands folded neatly in her lap as if she were already in court. Her eyes lowered but steady, never wavering. He asked her questions. How long had she served? Did she know of herbs? Did she cook, clean, sew? She answered each in a soft, measured tone, her voice weaving an armor of humility. She was just a seamstress. She knew thread, not poison. She knew fabric, not death. She was nothing but what they had always told her she was: invisible. But invisibility could not last forever. Later, alone in her cabin, Dina listened to the echoes of their boots retreating. She knew the sheriff was not satisfied. His silence had carried weight. His eyes had lingered too long. He would return. And next time, he would not come with questions. He would come with chains. Still, Dina did not tremble. She knew fear was the sheriff's real weapon, not the law, not the gallows. Fear made slaves confess to crimes they never committed. Fear made them betray one another. But Dina had mastered silence, and silence was her blade. Outside, the county was tightening its grip. But within her chest, Dina held a truth the sheriff could never chain. Knowledge was freedom, and knowledge was already spreading. The sun had barely risen over the Caldwell estate, yet the house already felt suffocating. Dina moved among the rooms with a quiet precision that had become second nature. Each garment she touched, each stitch she reinforced, was more than work. It was preparation. She wasn't just sewing, she was setting the stage for the inevitable reckoning. The family had grown restless. Samuel Caldwell's gambling losses had worsened, Margaret's health was frail, and even the children began to whisper of shadows in the hallways. The poisoned threads had begun their slow, invisible work. Fever, delirium, rashes. They crept silently, leaving no immediate trace, only questions and suspicion. Doctors had visited repeatedly, their hands clean of evidence, their minds baffled. Rumors spread through whispers. The house itself was cursed, some ancient retribution for sins long buried. Dina had studied the patterns of plant toxins meticulously. Nightshade for fever, monkshood for pain, hemlock for the mind. Each carefully measured and applied to the garments in places that would ensure maximum contact. Cuffs brushing skin, collars close to the neck. One misstep could undo everything, yet her hands were steady. Years of practice had made precision instinctive. Every movement was ritual, every stitch a silent prayer to the vengeance she carried in her heart. Outside the walls, the plantation began to feel the undercurrent of resistance. Other enslaved people had learned from her discreet notes and whispered lessons, knowledge of plants, of remedies, of poison. It circulated quietly, like a river under ice. Dina's rebellion was no longer hers alone. It had become a collective intelligence, a subtle but persistent threat to the hierarchy that had enslaved them. By mid-afternoon, Margaret Caldwell had begun to show the first symptoms. A burning rash along her wrists and neck, confusion in her eyes. The family's doctor was summoned, and he inspected her carefully, unaware that the source of her ailment was sewn into the very garments he examined. No cure existed for what he could not see, no justice for a wrong he could not name. Dina observed from the shadows, her heart tempered with sorrow and resolve. She did not rejoice in suffering, she understood necessity. The world had made her powerless, stolen her daughter, denied her voice. But now, in her hands, threads became instruments of truth and consequence. As evening fell, the house settled into uneasy silence, but Dina's resolve did not waver. Every stitch was part of a design, every garment a testimony. She was no longer a seamstress. She was an unseen force, a calculated shadow in a gilded cage. And the Caldwell family, with all their wealth and influence, had become unwitting participants in a ritual of reckoning that only Dina could orchestrate. By the following morning, the Caldwell estate was already gripped by unease. Margaret Caldwell awoke with burning skin along her neck and forearms, her mind fogged with fever and confusion. Samuel noticed the trembling in her hands and the erratic pulse. The children, too, complained of nausea and a strange weakness that left them pale and listless. What had seemed minor discomfort the day before now revealed itself as a creeping, insidious force. The family doctor arrived once more, a man well versed in symptoms yet entirely blind to cause. He inspected garments, dabbled in remedies, and offered potions and tonics. Nothing worked. Fever climbed, delirium set in, and panic began to ripple through the grand halls. The house, that once echoed with laughter, now resonated with whispered fears and mounting suspicion. The invisible enemy, poison, remained undetected, a shadow stitched into the very fabric of their lives. Dina moved through the estate like a ghost, quiet and precise. Her heart weighed heavy, yet there was resolve behind every step. She observed the reactions, noting which garments triggered the most profound effects, cataloguing symptoms as meticulously as she had the poisons themselves. This was no reckless act of vengeance. It was methodical, almost scientific. Knowledge was her weapon, precision her shield. She understood that one mistake could unravel everything, and the stakes were higher than ever. Outside the walls, whispers began to circulate among the enslaved community. People noticed the unusual illnesses, the odd timing, the sudden decline of the powerful Caldwells. They spoke in hushed tones about the seamstress who had taught them to read, to understand the plants in the fields, to turn nature itself into a means of justice. Dina had become more than a figure of quiet rebellion. She was the pulse of an emerging, subtle network of resistance. Her actions, though hidden, inspired those who had long been voiceless. By midday, the house descended into chaos. Margaret's delirium worsened, Samuel grew increasingly anxious, and the children cried out in fevered distress. Doctors could not explain the progression. Servants whispered behind closed doors, their glances sharp and fearful, wondering if the estate itself was cursed. Dina remained unseen, a shadow among shadows, orchestrating the invisible retribution. As evening fell, the Caldwells' confidence in their immunity to danger eroded. The poison had done more than harm. It had unsettled the hierarchy, shaken the foundations of their perceived control. Dina's carefully crafted plan moved forward with precision, a reminder that intelligence and courage could penetrate even the most fortified walls. In silence, she prepared for the next phase, knowing that patience and timing were as lethal as the poisons themselves. By the following week, unease had begun to seep beyond the walls of the Caldwell estate. Neighbors whispered of sudden fevers and delirium striking the family all at once, unusual enough to draw attention in a town accustomed to quiet servitude. The estate that once symbolized wealth and untouchable power now radiated fear, a warning echoing through the surrounding farms. Doctors, hired hastily from nearby towns, puzzled over the symptoms. Nothing in the medical texts accounted for the rapid selective effects on those who wore specific garments. Skin irritation, fever, vomiting, weakness, they were all common illnesses on their own. But combined with timing and location, a pattern emerged that even the most skeptical practitioner could not ignore. The threads, ordinary to the untrained eye, had become instruments of retribution. Inside the estate, Dina maintained her calm, a veneer of submission over a mind calculating every detail. She observed the household's chaos with quiet precision, her knowledge of plants, chemistry, and human physiology, allowing her to anticipate each reaction. She adjusted doses subtly, ensuring the illnesses were serious enough to alarm, but not immediately fatal. It was a delicate balance. One misstep could expose her. One miscalculation could destroy the fragile network of enslaved support quietly rallying around her. Outside, a subtle shift began among the enslaved community. Servants and field hands noticed the inconsistencies, the strange timing of afflictions, the careful placement of garments, the unexplained resilience of those who avoided certain fabrics. Whispers grew into cautious speculation, and Dina's silent guidance through literacy and knowledge transformed suspicion into understanding. The idea that one could resist, even against immense power, began to circulate quietly, igniting a fragile but significant morale among the oppressed. Meanwhile, the Caldwell family grew desperate. Samuel Caldwell, increasingly paranoid, ordered the inspection of every garment, every package, every seam. Doctors demanded explanations that could not be found in their books, while servants were interrogated for answers. Fear had replaced authority, leaving the family vulnerable to observation and manipulation. Each attempt to understand the sickness only deepened their frustration, a perfect diversion from the true source, the seamstress in plain sight. By the end of the week, the estate was a place of muted terror. The family's public facade of control cracked, revealing their fragility, while Dina remained an invisible orchestrator. Each day, she measured reactions, refined doses, and guided the subtle resistance forming under her unseen hand. Her intellect, long hidden behind the roles imposed upon her, had become the cornerstone of a rebellion that could not be traced yet, was undeniably potent. The threads of vengeance, silent yet deadly, tightened around the Caldwells. and with each passing day, the line between survival and exposure blurred, preparing the stage for the inevitable reckoning. Word of the Caldwell family's mysterious illnesses could no longer be contained. Rumors spread faster than the fever itself, reaching the ears of local authorities and neighboring landowners. A formal inquiry was demanded, a rare disruption in a world where the powerful typically remained untouchable. Physicians were summoned to testify, their uncertainty laying bare the limits of contemporary medicine. No natural cause explained the synchronized suffering, and speculation began to edge toward deliberate malice. Dina, ever vigilant, sensed the tightening noose. Each step in the investigation had to be anticipated, each question calculated. She had studied human behavior as carefully as she had studied plants. Her knowledge of toxicology and chemistry, once a private refuge, now became a shield. She adjusted her strategy, ensuring that no evidence could link her directly to the unseen poisons threaded into the household's clothing. The investigators began interviewing the household staff, starting with the youngest and most timid. Their fear of the Caldwells was immense, yet even fear could not suppress the whispering of truth. Hints of intentional mischief began to surface, though no one yet understood its source. Meanwhile, the family's own reports were inconsistent. Samuel's growing paranoia led him to contradict himself. Margaret's weakness and illness left her unable to provide coherent statements, and Constance, the matriarch, clung desperately to appearances, unknowingly strengthening the investigators' suspicions. Outside the grand estate, the network of enslaved individuals quietly observed the proceedings. Each conversation, each gesture of the investigators was carefully noted and relayed. Back to Dina, knowledge was her currency, and she spent it wisely, ensuring that the subtle threads of her plan remained invisible. Even as the investigation encroached, she maintained the illusion of innocence, walking the line between submission and control with near-perfect precision. By midweek, investigators identified a pattern. The illnesses correlated to clothing, specifically garments that had come directly from Dina's hands. The realization sparked whispers of witchcraft, intelligence and cunning beyond ordinary human capability. It was a notion terrifying and intoxicating, one that the authorities struggled to quantify, limited by societal assumptions about who could wield such power. Dina watched silently, guiding the narrative from the shadows. Every question asked, every hypothesis considered, fed her understanding of the family's vulnerabilities. The investigation, meant to unearth her crimes, only highlighted the brilliance of her calculated defiance. She was no ordinary victim. She had become the architect of a subtle, unstoppable revolt. The stage was set. Authorities now suspected deliberate action, yet they lacked any concrete proof. And in that space between suspicion and certainty, Dina's vengeance deepened, threading itself through the household like an invisible, unbreakable loom. The investigation had grown tense, the air in the Caldwell estate thick with suspicion, fear, and the faint chemical tang of poison. Dina, ever precise, knew the moment had arrived to execute the final phase of her plan. The sale of her daughter Sarah still loomed in her mind like a wound that refused to heal. Each stitch she made in the family's new clothing was deliberate. Each poisoned thread a calculated step toward justice that the law could never provide. Her hands moved with a rhythm born of necessity and rage, sewing silently as the household bustled around her, unaware that the fabric of their lives contained their undoing. The toxins, derived from carefully studied plants, would cause irritation, fever, and delirium, subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but potent enough to incapacitate and, in some cases, deliver death. Dina's mind, sharp as the needle she wielded, mapped out every interaction, anticipating how and when each family member would wear the garments. Outside, the town was alive with rumors of illness, a sense of dread creeping into even the most secure homes. Physicians were called again, their uncertainty mirrored in every furrowed brow, every whispered consultation. They could not yet connect the illness to Dina's handiwork, but their suspicions were growing. Each doctor's failed diagnosis, each ineffective treatment fed the invisible pattern that Dina had woven, making the Caldwells' suffering inevitable. In the dead of night, she observed the household, noting which garments were worn and the subtle reactions each person exhibited. Skin irritation, fever, weakness. These were the signs she had meticulously engineered, each one a testament to her knowledge and foresight. The matriarch, Constance, grew increasingly paranoid, lashing out at servants, unaware that the root of the chaos was closer than anyone could imagine. Dina's network of fellow enslaved individuals remained silent allies, observing from the shadows, reporting any shifts in the household dynamic, and safeguarding the secrecy of her methods. Knowledge was power, and they wielded it in a world designed to strip them of both. By sunrise, the family was incapacitated in varying degrees, the carefully orchestrated plan nearly complete. The balance of power had shifted subtly but irrevocably. Dina, once seen as a powerless seamstress, had turned her intellect, her skill, and her rage into an instrument of poetic, calculated justice. In the hush of early morning, she prepared for the final reckoning, the moment when the invisible hand of resistance she had cultivated for years would reveal its full impact. The Caldwells' gilded world was unraveling, thread by poisoned thread, and Dina remained as always the silent architect of the upheaval. The morning sun filtered through the Caldwell estate windows, casting long shadows over a household teetering on the edge of chaos. Dina moved quietly, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil she had unleashed. Fevered groans echoed through the halls, servants whispered in fear, and the family, once proud and untouchable, struggled under the weight of a mysterious, invisible force. Every stitch, every poisoned thread, had fulfilled its purpose with unnerving precision. Outside, neighbors speculated. Rumors spread like wildfire through the town. Illnesses that appeared overnight, strange rashes, sudden fainting, and delirium that left people questioning their own senses. Doctors, confused and frustrated, documented symptoms without finding a clear cause. They could not yet trace the chaos back to Dina's hands, but the pattern was becoming undeniable to the few who dared observe closely. The invisible logic of her vengeance was too precise to ignore. Dina watched from the margins, noting reactions, calculating the next moves of those who believed themselves powerful. Her daughter Sarah was safe for now, hidden in the knowledge that her mother's courage had rewritten the rules of survival and resistance. The skill that had once made Dina a seamstress now made her a silent general in a war against injustice. Every glance, every cough, every quivering hand told a story she had orchestrated, a story of patience, intelligence, and unyielding determination. Meanwhile, the Caldwells were fracturing from within. Constance, Samuel, and Margaret grew increasingly suspicious of one another, trust disintegrating as paranoia set in. The family's hierarchical structure, once rigid and unshakable, began to collapse. Dina's plan extended beyond revenge. It was a psychological dismantling of a household built on cruelty. She had learned early in life that power could be subtle, silent, and deadly. Poisoned threads were her instrument, observation her weapon. Authorities, alerted by the town's gossip and a few concerned doctors, began to converge. Investigators arrived under the guise of routine medical oversight, but Dina was already several steps ahead. Each document they examined, each question they asked, only reinforced the invisibility of her method. The secret network of knowledge she had nurtured among other enslaved people ensured that any misstep could be avoided. By the end of the day, the Caldwell estate was a house of whispers, sickness, and suspicion. Dina remained composed, a ghost in the machinery of her own design, watching as the consequences of her intelligence, courage, and meticulous planning unfolded. The household's power had been shaken, its pride humbled, and its members forced to confront forces they could neither see nor control. Dina had not merely poisoned their bodies, she had poisoned their illusions of control. By May 10, 1854, the tension surrounding the Caldwell estate had reached a fever pitch. Dina, ever cautious, sensed that the walls of secrecy she had built were beginning to crack. Neighbors whispered of strange illnesses. Doctors puzzled over untraceable fevers, and authorities were preparing to intervene. Her calculated silence, her calm demeanor, had kept her hidden for months, but now the weight of attention pressed close. The threads of her plan were fraying, and every careful step had to be precise. The investigation began in earnest. Officials arrived at the estate, armed with questions, suspicion, and the authority of the law. They questioned household staff, inspected the rooms, and examined clothing that had caused so much unseen destruction. Doctors noted the connection between the victims' symptoms and the new garments they wore, a revelation that only deepened the mystery. To them, the pattern was unprecedented. How could mere threads carry such a powerful, systematic poison? Dina's knowledge of chemistry and botany had kept her ahead of discovery. She had anticipated every possible inquiry, every assumption authorities might make, and had prepared contingencies. Yet the law, relentless in its pursuit, finally closed in. A young investigator, following the subtle threads of suspicion, traced the illnesses directly back to the seamstress, whose hands had shaped every garment. The evidence was irrefutable. Dina was arrested under the watchful eyes of the very society she had quietly defied. Her arrest sent ripples through the town. The neighbors who had speculated in hushed tones now gawked openly. Families whispered about the audacity of the enslaved seamstress who had dared to challenge her oppressors with intellect and precision. The Caldwell estate, once a bastion of wealth and authority, became a public symbol of vulnerability, corruption, and the terrifying consequences of underestimating those held in subjugation. In the courthouse, the narrative unfolded with shocking clarity. Dina's methods, her intelligence, and her motives were laid bare. The authorities documented her use of botanical poisons applied to intimate clothing, the chain of deaths she had orchestrated, and the courage that had fueled her rebellion. Spectators, constrained by social norms and racial prejudices, struggled to reconcile the brilliance of her strategy with the violent disruption it had caused. Though detained, Dina remained composed. Her defiance was quiet but potent. She had forced a society built on cruelty and ownership to confront its own fragility. Through meticulous planning and precise execution, she had rewritten the rules, exposing the Caldwell family's tyranny and the hidden knowledge of resistance that enslaved people carried. Dina's capture marked not the end of her story, but the turning point where hidden truths emerged, forcing society to confront what it had long denied. The courthouse fell silent as Dina's story reached its apex. Her arrest had exposed the Caldwell family's cruelty, but it also revealed something far deeper, a system designed to suppress knowledge, intelligence, and courage in those it enslaved. While Dina faced the inevitability of her punishment, the truth of her rebellion could not be erased. Her methods, her intellect, her daring defiance had become a symbol whispered among those who knew the dangers of challenging authority. Historians would later uncover fragments of her journals, hidden among the few possessions allowed to leave the estate. In these writings, Dina recorded her botanical experiments, her calculations of dosage, and most importantly, her reasoning. She spoke not of hatred but of justice, of reclaiming agency in a life that had been systematically stolen. Each entry was a testament to the human mind's ability to resist even under unimaginable oppression. The trial itself became a study in moral contradiction. The law recognized the murder, yet the jury and public could not ignore the circumstances that led a young woman to commit such an act. Questions arose. Could a person truly be guilty when every instinct of survival and justice compelled them to act? Could a society so invested in ownership claim innocence in the deaths caused by its own systemic cruelty? Dina's actions blurred the lines between criminality and heroism, forcing a community to confront its own complicity. After her conviction, Dina's fate was sealed. She was executed on May 20th, 1854, a mere 10 days after her arrest. Yet even in death, she refused to vanish quietly. Her story spread beyond Kentucky, whispered among enslaved communities and eventually documented by historians who recognized the extraordinary intelligence and courage behind her revolt. The Caldwell estate, once a symbol of dominance, became a cautionary tale, a reminder that knowledge, skill, and determination could never be fully controlled. Generations later, Dina's legacy lives on. Scholars, descendants, and storytellers continue to uncover the suppressed truths of her life. Her rebellion serves as a reminder that beneath the veneer of submission, intellect and agency can thrive, waiting for the moment to challenge the most entrenched systems of power. In the end, Dina's story is not just a tale of revenge or survival. It is a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the unsettling truth that power can always be subverted. History tried to erase her, society tried to silence her, but the threads she wove, both literal and metaphorical, still carry a message that echoes across time. Courage and intelligence cannot be confined. The final question remains, unanswerable and haunting. How many more stories like Dina's lie buried, waiting for someone daring enough to uncover them?